Welcome to the Legal Innovation Forum's podcast series, Leading at the Intersection of Business and Law. I'm Lucy Saddleton, Managing Editor at the Legal Innovation Forum. Today we're interviewing David Curran, Co-Chair of Sustainability and ESG Advisory Practice and Executive Director of the ESG and Law Institute at Paul Weiss. David is going to discuss the business case for ESG and share with us his views on the role of lawyers in helping to navigate ESG issues. Thank you for listening, and please stay tuned for our next podcast.
Welcome to our podcast. Today we are interviewing David Cochrane, who is a New York City-based lawyer with deep experience at the intersection of business, law, technology, compliance, and risk readiness. David is the co-chair of the Sustainability and ESG Advisory Practice and is executive director of the ESG and Law Institute at Paul Weiss. He is responsible for continuing to develop and promote the firm's ESG practices. David also serves as a co-chair of the New York State Bar Association's ESG Committee, which aims to educate and engage New York lawyers, law students, and faculty on ESG practices and developments through thought leadership and robust educational programs. Welcome to the podcast, David.
Thank you, Andrew. It's nice to be here.
So tell us a little bit about your career journey to date and how it's led to your current focus at Paul Weiss. And secondarily, tell us why its ESG practice is a unique platform in the legal ecosystem.
Well, thanks. I've had certainly a non-linear journey to the current role, which I think, Andrew, actually suits me quite well for the challenges that not only that we face in terms of the practice that I run. I also am the head of ESG for a law firm, and as you mentioned, lead a thought leadership forum. And to be able to have that kind of diversity and versatility, you need to have had the non-linear journey. Started out as a trial lawyer in New York, doing a lot of intellectual property, First Amendment, media law work. And then I went in-house for years. And so I spent about 30 years inside companies, major companies such as Campbell Soup Company, Thomson Reuters, Reader's Digest, in both legal roles and business roles. So I've been the general counsel of publicly traded companies. I've held basically every C-suite title you can hold except for CFO within organizations. And then a unique opportunity presented itself right before COVID hit in 2020. Paul Weiss has been very famous and well known for what I would describe as matching practice with purpose. A titan of a law firm with an impeccable legal reputation that also leaned into some of the most important issues of generations. The firm is famous for its support of civil rights. Our firm worked on the Brown versus Board of Education case, among many, many others. And I'd always admired our chairman, Brad Karp, and the firm. I'd been a client of Paul Weiss, both as a business person and as a general counsel, and knew that the firm just had a unique presence in the legal community, but also the community that supported and fostered a wide variety of social issues, ranging from, as I mentioned, civil rights to women's rights and the like. So in a discussion with the chairman, I had discussed gaps that the legal ecosystem was challenged by. And when I say the legal ecosystem, I start at the roots of the educational process, law schools, going through to law firms, and then ultimately to either government or corporate legal roles. And I'd been worked at companies and done thought leadership for years on some of these topics where law and transformation, technology, and a variety of other issues that were challenging for lawyers, and that I thought through one of the roundtable series that I was running, ESG Collides with the Law, that I had validated that not only were lawyers not fully aware of sustainability and ESG issues, they were nowhere on those issues, in particular in the United States. A little bit different in Europe, but the entire profession, in my view, was really behind. And I was seeing really the makings for a catastrophe, that if lawyers weren't aware of the very complex legal and societal issues related to ESG, and I know we're going to go into that, especially at the best law firms in the world, then how would their clients be advised with the proper amount of context and substantive knowledge? And so in a discussion with the chairman, we decided that it made sense for Paul Weiss, having taken the lead in other instances in the profession, to take the lead here and to start the first of its kind dedicated practice. And I describe it, Andrew, as being brought out of law firm retirement. I mean, I'd spent 30 years not at law firms. I'd been a client, but not worked in a law firm. And I had not practiced law, and actually do not practice law in this role. So I'm a unicorn, a very unusual role that I occupy at a law firm, but very purposeful. And you asked, the second part of your question is how it's unique and how it's different. One, it has somebody like me who I wasn't a lateral. I wasn't practicing at a law firm. I wasn't at this firm or any other firm. So I didn't come with either the knowledge of that. So I might have been ignorant, but I also didn't come with some of the baggage. I wasn't steeped in law firm tradition and knew that in order to address modern, rapidly changing things, you needed to approach it with a modern approach, and to bring technology, bring data and analytics, bring a very proactive approach to addressing systemic issues in a more comprehensive way. Law firms are amazing. This firm was amazing and will be amazing. Law firms are also not they have not kept up overall with what their in-house clients are challenged by. The myriad of issues and kinds of challenges that in-house lawyers have really are not addressed the same way at law firms. And so we wanted to go right at that problem, go at the gap, the chasm that existed, and create a practice. So the design of our practice is different from any other practice that I'm aware of, in that we specifically have business professionals on our team who are not lawyers, who are steeped in ESG and sustainability, steeped in technology, AI, steeped in data and analytics, systems, processes, program and project management, things that most lawyers are not really trained in, and they're certainly not expert in. And we brought that into our practice so that we would be able to match our clients' needs with a 360-degree view. So we call it an advisory practice on purpose. And the other part of it that is, I think, quite different is that it ties directly into our own internal program. They educate one another. This is the only area, Andrew, that I'm aware of systemically where law firms actually swim along with their clients in terms of the issues of the day. So, an example, if a lawyer at a law firm advises on antitrust or ERISA or a tax, typically they're not involved themselves as a firm in the same issue. So they're not subject to the antitrust issue that they're advising their clients about. They're not subject necessarily to the issues that they're advising. In this case, we're an entity, a very large entity, multi-billion-dollar business that actually has engagement in ESG and sustainability issues alongside our clients. In fact, we're in some cases codependent with our clients. We are a vendor. And so I very much wanted to make sure that they were informing one another. And our clients really appreciate that. We live along with them. We have to do a lot of the things that they have to do. And I think the largest thing that was missing in my view of outside counsel to inside counsel, having spent time in both places, was empathy and context, understanding what our in-house counterparts were experiencing, and then being able to provide that substantive legal advice, but with that understanding.
Thank you for that introduction. One question I have, structurally speaking, when you talk about the ESG advisory group at Paul Weiss, which you had, it does sound like it might be better off sitting in a strategy consulting firm. So why do you think it's uniquely positioned and of more value to the end user, which are corporate legal departments, plus the broader organizations they're a part of, versus, say, won't name names, but classic advisory firms that we all know the names of?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and it goes to the nub of why we're doing what we're doing. We're not replacing them, Andrew. We don't have thousands of people, armies of data analysts and the like to do the good work that advisory firms do in this space. We're never going to calculate anybody's greenhouse gas emissions. That's not what a law firm does. That said, one of the gaps that I was talking about that I had identified, again, I didn't have my resume out to work at a law firm. The gap was that those consultants who are not trained as lawyers, most of them, are dealing with regulatory governance, corporate governance, which requires a lot of legal understanding, securities law, disclosure laws, environmental laws, that they're frankly not equipped to handle, and certainly not equipped to handle as well as lawyers. Consultants are terrific, but they're not the precise risk mitigation experts at language that lawyers are. They're not the ones that give final review of a 10K or a securities filing or an IPO documentation. The lawyers are the last rung before things go public for anything that matters at a high profile company. And consultants are fantastic at doing the work that goes into that. But we knew that there was a gap. And that gap was lawyers not reviewing, for example, the company's websites, their sustainability reports, their product materials, marketing collateral, their products. I worked for years in product companies, very high profile corporations. I was a lawyer doing that work. And I know just how meticulous you need to be, how careful you need to be, and how you word things when you take on external commitments. If you say you're going to do X, Y, or Z publicly in terms of social engagement, this isn't an esoteric, woke, or nice to have. These are mission critical, core to business operations, and they should be given the same gravitas and review and pressure testing. And they were not, frankly. Lawyers in the US in particular, US law firms, were not reviewing these things. And they were being reviewed by consultants with their counterparts in-house. And we've seen the landscape is littered with companies that have gotten into trouble for documents that were not reviewed by lawyers, for programs and policies not reviewed by lawyers, for governance programs not reviewed or even involving lawyers. 5 years ago, hard to imagine, but 5 years ago, many of these issues that are now commonplace that come across a lawyer's desk at a company never saw the light of day in a legal department. And so my personal mission was to address that. And the way to do that was through one of the great law firms of the world, because the great law firms of the world need to address this just like they do securities, just like they do M&A diligence. These are core to our clients' interests, and they are reputational and legal risks that are often outweigh a lot of the other risks that lawyers get involved with. So it's an inverse ratio. Oddly, lawyers were not involved in some of the biggest, most high-profile commitments that companies were making because they weren't considered, quote, legal. And frankly, they were wrong. And I think people have found out that they were wrong. And now lawyers are scurrying around to try and figure out how to get involved, how to get educated. And to my point earlier about law schools, one of the other reasons to join this firm, which is an amazing firm, is that we have heavy engagement. And through the ESG and Law Institute, the thought leadership platform, we have now engaged with a variety of top tier law schools to try and address the gap at the law school level. And I knew that the prestige of this firm and the support that I would have at this firm would do that. And we're doing that. We're making progress at law schools.
Yeah, absolutely. I've seen some of the information on the partnership you have with Berkeley, for example. I mean, lots of questions from there. I think from a business standpoint, you've identified a gap that exists, right? A pain point, and you're addressing that pain point. Do you find yourselves, when you are working with your clients, are you working with other departments aside from legal? And if you are, do you notice any patterns by sector?
So the quick answer is absolutely yes. In fact, there isn't a project that we've been involved with. And Andrew, we work with over 100 major corporations around the globe on these issues, very typically at the very senior level within those companies. And at that senior level, it's the C-suite, boards, CEOs, CFOs, chief sustainability officers, chief risk officers, chief privacy officers, because there are many implications for For privacy, ESG directly relates to AI and the use of AI. AI tools are very much more. So we've worked with human resources, with investor relations, public relations, marketing. And in fact, part of the advisory practice part is we help our clients understand the landscape so that we help guide them on things that they're trying to do and achieve in their governance processes and systems. As I mentioned earlier, I view and our team views these things from a systemic standpoint. We don't just take a nail and hammer it. We find out what kind of surface are we hammering it into? Why are we hammering it? How did we get the hammer? All of those elements are really important. And I was very fortunate early in my career to work with engineers. I worked in a food company for years and I led the crisis management and the systemic issues at a food company. And when you have a crisis, a food crisis, you have a real crisis because people can become ill and such. So I learned about how to reverse engineer what engineers would describe as critical control point analysis. So our advisory piece of our practice looks at critical control points for our clients and helps them understand not only how does it work within their organization, because often they don't know. They don't know where the data comes. For example, lawyers are not trained to understand where greenhouse gas emission data comes from, or water, or plastics. They don't know necessarily where the data goes for issues in the S category. So we help them understand where it comes from, how to pressure test it, whether it's reliable, and to also help them understand the ecosystem of other service providers. I think a unique element of our platform from other law firms is we know that we'll have consultants involved. We know that there'll be data companies, technology companies. My experience is data and tech companies for 20 years coming to this firm. I was leading an AI company, helping lead an AI company before I got to Paul Weiss. So I know what our clients are trying to achieve and their ecosystem. I describe it, Andrew, as the risk of risk. So who's in it that they're relying on that may not be that reliable? Who has pressure tested what? So I'll give you an example. A lot of lawyers, securities lawyers, will look at the end product and say, needs to be in the 10K. This is a disclosure that's subject to X, Y, and Z law. And technically, that's absolutely true. But what makes up the information for the disclosure? Because this is so new to lawyers and, frankly, to the world, there's no code, there's no precedent, there's no one way to do it. There's no gap accounting principles, FASB principles that everybody agrees to. So a lot of it is self-reported. A lot of it is cobbled together. But the lawyers will say, well, these are the numbers and we should publish these. We go further upstream and we will work with the consultants, the technology, the data companies to pressure test what goes into the funnel before it gets distilled for disclosure. And that's, I think, and I think we think, very much a strategic advantage. Most other lawyers just wait for the outcome and then we'll review a document and then that's what happens. We do that process, of course, but our clients need help upstream. And this is all new to them and very challenging. And they often have no time to make decisions. And if you don't have the right information at the right time, often you won't make the right decisions. So we spend a lot of time on the governance process. How do they handle this from a management standpoint? Who gets what information? What's the source of the information? And then how does it flow through boards? And then ultimately to outside of the company.
Switching gears slightly, and you kind of touched on it in the last part there, last few statements. What and how is the focus changing on the ground when it comes to ESG and corporations? What are if you could pick three, you said governance is a top area, give us three quick bullet points on where the biggest pain points are. What are the things that are concerning corporations the most right now?
Well, I think the scrutiny and public access to information with a heightened set of lenses, the availability of information, the ability to connect dots using AI, for example, from the outside of a company is something that companies didn't have to contend with 5-7 years ago. They were the keepers and the creators of knowledge about their company. Now, depending upon the size of the company, often people outside of the company know more about what the company has said about things than the company itself. So that's a significant shift. The other is that a number of the very public commitments that were made not by lawyers, and as I mentioned earlier, not involving lawyers. So they were made by various groups and companies, and they were well-intentioned, and they fully embraced those issues. The challenge was they were not met with the same rigor for substantiation, for example, that financials would be, that if you were launching a new product, a new division. In these large organizations, there were lots of pockets and silos where people had free rein to say things publicly, including CEOs of companies. And since there weren't really any consequences, they could say things and there wasn't really a way to challenge them. The single biggest shift is there are now ways to challenge them. Also, these issues are hyper focused. If you think about the world PC, pre-COVID, BC, before COVID, and today, everything has changed, but including how stakeholders are looked at. So stakeholders being, I think lawyers tend to view core stakeholders as investors and governments. For most people, the real stakeholders are consumers, customers, and employees. People don't come to work and individuals. I'm not talking about lawyers. Regular people who are working in marketing, sales, product, they don't come to work and wonder how they're going to apply the law today or how to abide by the law. They go, we got to get more customers, we got to get more consumers, period. That's their job. And we need to support those customers and we need to make sure they're happy. So I think the media has really misunderstands these issues because regardless of what regulators are doing, and we can talk about that, but regulators are catching up here, Andrew. They were far behind, especially in the US. The other thing is that the US is far behind. Americans tend to think US first, US centric, everything begins and ends here. That's absolutely not the case. Virtually every E issue was launched and led and organized and put forth in Europe and elsewhere, but mainly Europe, long before Americans started to get involved. Recycling, addressing climate and greenhouse gases. That started outside of the US through NGOs typically, and then the UN became involved. This didn't start in Alabama or Kansas. And if you would, again, focus on the media, you would think that's the case. You would think that it's some state regulator that is leading the charge here. They're far behind, catching up, and they're being caught up because their constituents, their stakeholders, are telling them that this is important to them. So the biggest change is the view of these issues and the scrutiny and the reputational impact and blast zone for getting it wrong. If you got something wrong 5 years ago, you were barely noticed. Now, if you get something wrong, it's very conspicuous. And I would just add substantively, the generational shift has been huge for the impact, especially on consumer-based companies. The demands here that we're talking about in the E and S category, they're not esoteric. They're core to this generation. And I was talking to somebody at a very large consultancy, and 85% of their professional workforce is under the age of 40. 85%. And that generation, those generations, I should say, in that time frame, think very differently than my generation did about the environment, very differently about workers' rights and these issues, human rights. And what the challenge, Andrew, is that my generation is still leading a lot of law firms in the legal department. So they're making decisions based on the lenses that we have. The people that are driving the change are 27 years old and they want these things and they're not going back. They don't care what the regulators say or do in this regard, if they agree with it or not. They want less plastic. They want better air. They want these things. I'm not telling them what to say. They're saying it. And so they're demanding it of their consumer product companies. They're demanding it of their employers. And that's actually the change that has happened. Much more power than, say, 25 years ago that consumers and employers had, employees had. The other just societal change is the power of social media. It didn't exist as a power 10 years ago. Now it drives everything. A single human being can change the world. And a teenager from the Nordic states can get a speaking engagement at the UN. That just didn't happen back in the day. And companies had time to respond. Companies had time to create their own messaging. It just doesn't exist anymore. People are creating the messaging for you. The lawyers are behind in that. They're still operating in many situations, and this is what we're working with our clients on, is catching up with that fact.
Right. Very interesting points there. And I think, tying that together, when you look at that concept of stakeholders, right? And lawyers have that definition of what stakeholders are traditionally, as you said, investors, regulators, boards, etc. That's shifted, and those stakeholders are consumers, but those consumers are often employees too. And what you're saying there, at least how I read it, is that they're interested in outcomes, which goes back to the metaphor. We don't care which hammer is hammering the nail. We care about the outcome of what the impact of that nail going into the board is, for example. So I think that is a very interesting and obviously sort of fast moving kaleidoscope of areas that need to be considered and addressed in this. So, just sort of working on that sort of scrutiny, there has been a lot of scrutiny, and again, covered in the press, which of course the press depends, and they like to cover things and sometimes exaggerate stories to some extent, but there has been, some pushback on this concept of ESG, particularly in the US. And so from institutional investors, and to some extent, it's become a politicized issue. And I wanted to get what your view on that is on the ground. The US isn't the only market in the world. In Europe, as you said, that's where this has extended from, the concepts surrounding ESG. But what's your take on that? How big a story is this?
Well, I think the media is ill-informed. Most of the people who are writing about, say, the death of ESG or they're not on the ground. They don't know what's happening. There are too many genies out of too many bottles, Andrew, to put them back. And again, this isn't incidental that this started and is led by Europe. Most major corporations, they have investors, employees, consumers in Europe. And so even if they wanted to opt out, they can't. The European regulators don't care about what the US regulators do. They don't care about the American. It's politicized here in America. It's not, and it's politicized in a minority of places. So the media would have you think that everybody has abandoned ship and these things are going. It's absolutely not the case. Companies need to have strong and rigorous governance. They need to substantiate things that they say, where they say it, what they say, how they say. These are material issues for most companies. They're important issues, even if not legally material. These are important issues for companies. And the anti-ESG, I'm not going to call it a movement. I'm going to call it a counter movement, because movements actually are things that affect substantive change. And the movement has already happened, and they're not going back. Companies are not going to pollute more. They're not going to do products with more plastic. They're not going to create more greenhouse gases. They're not going to away from paying living wage, paying women less than men. These are the issues that have been around for years. The acronym has become a lightning rod for a minority of people within a minority of states. If you do popular surveys in the United States, a vast majority of Americans want these issues, and they want their corporations to follow them. How they do it is very important. And that's from the very first day of operation for this practice. We've been focused. We don't advocate for anything. We're not lobbying. We're not doing any of the sort at our firm. What we're doing is helping our clients, like we do in everything else, make sure that what they say can be substantiated, that they have a governance process to help them with language that they need to use that is appropriate, accurate, all of the things that they can do so that they don't get sued. And if they do get sued, they win, so that they don't get investigated. And if they do get investigated, the investigation goes away, so that they can do deals. We haven't talked about all of the positives of sustainability, and that's a huge thing. Lawyers never want to talk about upsides. They only talk about risk. More money is being deployed, more capital is being deployed, and higher growth rates to sustainable investments than any other. So again, the media would have you think that everybody's abandoned ship. That's absolutely not accurate. Despite adjustments in language and governance processes by financial institutions, for example, they still have more investments today than they did 2 years ago when this politicizing started to happen. There are more ESG funds today with institutional investors and asset managers than there were 2 years ago. And why is that? Because people are demanding it. And they outperform, in many cases, other investments. The Biden infrastructure money, most of it is related to renewable energy, less gas and oil intensive businesses and the like. So there's money to be made. There, in the space of acquisitions, a company that has green credentials is going to sell for a premium over a company that does not. That's capitalism at its best. People want to work with companies that are being smart in this area. And our clients, like everybody else, are doing diligence on deals where companies are making claims. You need to substantiate those claims like you would if I told you I had 100 patents. I better have 100 patents or I'm not going to pay the price unless I have that inventory. This is not my opinion. This isn't esoteric. Isn't my personal feelings. It has nothing to do with it. If your company is set on its product that is doing something X or on a website that is doing Y, they have to substantiate that in order to go through the diligence process, in order to get through the scrutiny of regulators. They have to do it like they have to do everything else. So the shift, and this really is important, Andrew, and at the core of why I'm doing what I'm doing, the shift needs to happen in legal education. Law schools, with a few exceptions, are not teaching this. Lawyers don't know anything about this. And to me, that's a tragedy. The fact that the best and the brightest who come from the top law schools in this country today don't know even what ESG stands for, even if they, quote, agree with it or not. I don't understand that. How could you have gone through 7 years of higher education, be the best and the brightest, be the top of your class, and not know that these issues are paramount to our clients? If a company has taken a position that they're going to spend $1 billion on something to achieve an E result, that's important. And it's important to them, and it's important to their customers and stakeholders and other stakeholders we talked about. How is it that law schools are not instructing their students on this? That is the most significant gap in the ecosystem. On the positive side, young lawyers, young students love this topic. When they do offer it, when people do talk to it, I get a lot of inbound inquiries from lawyers who are very interested in this topic. They don't know much about it, but they're very interested. And then when you explain that this isn't esoteric, it's not political, it's actually real good old-fashioned lawyering where you make sure that you have governance processes. They go, oh, that's interesting to me. You mean I can include this in my M&A due diligence process? Yes, you not only should, you have to. Yeah, I can include this when I'm preparing a company to be an IPO. Yes. When I'm setting up a fund for a private equity. Yes. When I'm dealing with issues related to looking at our benefits plans or to our DE&I programs at our company. Yes, you have to apply the rigor that lawyers apply to it uniquely. It's fun for them. They're excited about it. So it's a generational shift that needs to happen within law as well. People of my generation and old and maybe a bit younger haven't caught on the fact that this is the future. It is now. It's like you and I've talked, Andrew, about AI. A lot of lawyers who've never really used the technology think it's coming. It's here. So is ESG. Mm-hmm. It's here. It's been here for years. It's just now getting focused.
Lots of spin-off questions in my mind about that. So if we were to, take a snapshot of ESG September 2024, and again, it's a bit of a broad brush because I'm going to ask cross-sectorally, which elements right now can have the most accretive value for businesses of incorporating those? Where do you see those having the highest impact within organizations and for their stakeholders?
So that's a big question, and I may not be the expert person most knowledgeable for that, but a couple of things. One is, this is everybody's issue. This isn't marketing's issue, IR, HR. The thing that's interesting about sustainable issues is in order to have a sustainable organization, you need to sell more tomorrow than you did today. You need to have more customers tomorrow than you did yesterday. And so engagement in truly understanding the essence of what sustainability is. Again, that's been hijacked politically, but that's what it is how is our organization going to be here 10 and 15 years from now? And that's a fundamental question for law firms. One that I think we're addressing at our firm. That is, This is a core component to every core practice. So if you're securities, capital markets, M&A, general corporate, public company, IPO work, et cetera, this needs to be ubiquitous. And it should not be thought as something separate. It is not separate. If you do a deal today to buy a technology company, you don't look at the technology as intellectual property as separate from the deal. You're buying the intellectual property. Sustainability is intellectual property. It is property of a company, and it is very valuable. And in fact, the misfires related to reputational misfires related to this are often more severe than even the initial monetary impact. So if a company is found out to be greenwashing, for example, that's not good for business. And even if the issue at stake wasn't that significant, it now becomes significant because you're not viewed as genuine. And that's a big problem in the marketplace. Lawyers, the value we can add, I describe it as we have superpowers. We're the only true fiduciaries at organizations. There are people that are well-intentioned and great, but we have a separate standard, ethics standard that nobody else has, a licensing standard. And what I'm seeing is lawyers that embrace this and understand that this is part of their remit are able to bring that superpower to their colleagues within organizations and to their clients outside of their organizations to help them understand the systems process. Like, how does human resources relate to legal, relate to investor relations, relate to marketing? They all relate to one another, and including at law firms, and with the exception, obviously, of investors. But in that context, embedding this, owning it, it becomes core to what you're doing. It is not separate. It is not, it's included. You wouldn't do a large transaction without a tax analysis or an employment law analysis, ERISA, et cetera. This should be standard issue. Nobody should be debating it. But yet, some law professors are debating it as if they have the right to debate it. It's really not theirs. It's not their opinion that matters. What matters is the fact that, again, stakeholders have determined these are important. Whether I like it or you like it is really not that relevant. The general consensus of people is that these are important issues, so companies need to address them. And we're better than, I see this as just amazing upside for lawyers. Lawyers have been losing business to you mentioned to consultants. They've been losing business to consultants for years and years and years. And I think wrongfully, I think a lot of really the best and the brightest are still lawyers in many situations, and they're under leveraged. And so we get to focus in this area and give lawyers a chance to get back in the room. They lost their opportunity to be in these rooms in the years I've seen it. And now they're back in the rooms. They're back in doing what they do best, which is making sure that the companies are doing these things. They're applying the rigor. Nobody's going to do that but lawyers.
Yeah. Interesting point on lawyers. And one of our key core themes we're focused on at the forum is that we are certainly living in a risk-on world. This decade's been an acceleration of a risk-on world. And I think it's not going to be risk-off for quite some time. And that unique skill set that lawyers have, or those superpowers, as you call them, I think are extremely valuable in helping companies navigate this risk-on environment. And there's myriad risks, right? And they're constantly evolving, constantly changing. It's almost that each year is completely different in the era we live in right now. What would you suggest if you're a lawyer listening to this? How do you embrace that risk-on world and leverage the skills that you learned along the path in your career, if you're embarking on a career? Synthesizing those down to a couple key points. How can you really, really add value in this new era as a lawyer for organizations you're working within or working for?
Well, the first guiding principle that I have is be open to everything and attached to nothing. I don't know if it was Confucius, some great philosopher, leader said this long time ago. I really believe that I mentioned my career journey. It's definitely nonlinear. And for years, I was criticized for that I was being too curious, that I was understanding businesses too much and not just focusing on, quote, the law. That risk on, Andrew, is exactly how I would describe it. It's been around a long time. Lawyers are slow to catch up. But instead of fearing it, embrace it. So you have to be your own instructor, however. You're going to need to be naturally curious. You're going to have to go out there, You guys produce this podcast, not because of me, but the work that you're doing is really important to understand, to distill, synthesize, to curate. I spend a lot of time on LinkedIn because that's where the action is. You won't find this at law schools. And frankly, I'm teaching in a business, I've taught in several business school classes. They're catching up as well. Where I find the best stuff is on LinkedIn. There's some amazing material being produced, mostly by not lawyers, that lawyers need to intimately understand. So instead of fearing it, embrace it. Understand, like technology, this is here to stay. You can either be swallowed by it or you can own it. And the folks in our practice and the many clients, great clients we work on, they're owning this. They're not denying it. They're, in fact, most of them are embracing it as saying, this is really interesting and fun. Going back for 200 years of precedent on some boring first year law topic, that's not me. There are people who love doing that. I would be not that person. I'm a citizen of this society. I buy products just like everybody else. And I work with companies, and I want to work with companies that are doing things well, that they're embracing these things. I describe it as practice with purpose. So many lawyers, as you know, lawyers have a high amount of stress. This is a very difficult profession. Addiction, divorce, and suicide rates are higher than other people in society. That's not by accident. This is a challenging thing to do. So I would rather work on things that I know are contributing positively to the organizations I'm in and to society than not. And I think that's what lawyers have been lacking. They may be brilliant at what they do, but there's a gap to them spiritually. And what's exciting about the work that we do is we get to marry those two things. We get to help our clients who are doing great things do them better and help them mitigate risk while they're doing those. And there's nothing more fulfilling that I've ever done in almost 40 years now that I've seen. So being your own instructor, networking, reaching out to people in a way, there are so many great people who are very willing to give their time to teach and to learn and to introduce you to things. And once you do, what I have found is once lawyers get beyond the perimeter of the political noise and to actually understand what the lawyering is, they go, oh, we actually do this. We're already doing this. We're just going to do it with an expanded set of lenses. That's exactly right. Mostly what I do, Andrew, is demystify this. This isn't alchemy. It isn't new. It's actually old. What's new is the scrutiny and the public's insistence on it. But these things have been around a long time. And so it's really fun to see the legal community finally getting those superpowers unearthed. Why did they go to law school? Going back to the roots of why they wanted it. And the lawyers who are going to thrive here are the ones that love transformation, like change. The ones that are not are going to be left behind. And that's the risk. And they already have been. You mentioned earlier the consultants. The consultants have taken away a lot of business from lawyers. And that's a shame because lawyers have missed out. And I think this is the most fun and interesting legal work. And I know that the people who are involved with it agree with me. So I encourage all lawyers to take their political stuff off, take the baggage that they hear about in the media off, and just learn. The more you learn, the more you're educated, the better you'll be, and the better a counselor you'll be for your clients.
Right. Fantastic answer. And I think so many things to distill from that. But probably the biggest one is that your path as a lawyer, it will be nonlinear. And that's something that's should be embraced because it will make your career path much more interesting. Final question, more related to the sort of big picture ESG topic, is looking at, let's say, the rest of this decade, because we're coming to the midpoint of it. What are the key challenges, opportunities, again, 2 or 3, in the years coming ahead as we head towards 2030?
Well, I think I'll underscore just some of the things we've already been talking about, Andrew, because it's not new from what I've been saying for the last 45 minutes. One is that if you think this is going away, you're wrong. So either you embrace it, it swallows you. And a lot of lawyers think that they're sort of in control of everything, and they're not. So I would relax with that idea and realize that this is something that these challenges and opportunities are actually good for the profession. those challenges will be, it's interesting that I have such different discussions than I did 4 years ago today with our clients. Today, it's not arguing whether lawyers should be involved with it. It's like, how do I get budget? What should my board be thinking about? These are great evolutionary transition points. So lawyers using their skills and understanding to help propel that and support that will be, I think, over the next 3 to 5 years, really important. The fact that these issues are going to become even more significant, the technology is going to advance rapidly in the next 3 years. I mean, Andrew, if you and I were imagining the scenario that you and I were having a podcast about this topic the way we're having it 4 years ago, you probably would have been laughed at. If somebody had told me 20 minutes before I had the meeting with our chairman before joining this firm that I was going to join the firm, I would have laughed out loud. Turns out being open to everything and attached to nothing means that if you embrace it, these challenges become opportunities, especially for lawyers. I would view this, and I know in talking with the leaders of a number of major law firms that they're trying to figure out how to embrace and engage with this. They're not fighting it anymore, and that's good. We need the legal profession, especially lawyers at law firms, who are the ultimate people advising these companies. They need to get educated and embrace it because others in the organization know more than they do. And that's not a good position. You don't want to be in that position when you're a lawyer. You want to know as much or more than your client does about a topic. That's usually what makes them really excel as counselors. They're super smart and they can tell you things that you can't know. And so it's exciting. I know that the kinds of issues that are bouncing around in sustainability may change a bit, but the path is clear. It's going forward, not backward. It's like companies are not, as I mentioned earlier, they're not going to pollute more. They're not going to abandon their marketing campaigns to do these things. There are going to be slips and slides, and some people will do this, and people will view those as divining rods for the future. As I said, these generations are not going to allow that to happen, and companies know they need it, and their legal departments know that they need to embrace it.
Well, I think that's a great point to end on. So I want to thank you, David, very much. Extremely interesting discussion. I would say we could probably do 4 or 5 more podcasts on this topic, and maybe we will. But appreciate you taking your time, sharing your expertise. Fascinating work you and Paul Weiss as a firm are engaged with, and look forward to hearing more on how this journey evolves for both of you, as well as the broader ESG story. So thanks again.
Thank you, Andrew. Appreciate the time. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for tuning in to the Legal Innovation Forum podcast. Stay tuned on our website for the next edition. You can listen to us on all your favorite podcast platforms. Tune in on liforum.co/podcasts.